Thanks for doing that. Our first speaker this afternoon is David Shoebridge. Just an introduction, David went into the upper house in state government in September 2010, and his previous life was a barrister, so maybe he's gone into politics for a rest, I'm not sure. I don't think so though, the amount of work he does.
You found me out.
His portfolios basically are forestry, justice, industrial relations, and of course today what he's going to talk about is planning and local government. So give a warm welcome to David Shoebridge.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm pretty sure Andrew took my initial membership application more than a decade ago to the Greens. I'd like to thank Lex for the welcome and acknowledge myself that we're meeting on the land of the Darug and the Ku-ring-gai people, and pay my respects to those elders past and present, including yourself, Lex. So, sovereignty's never been ceded over this land. It's also a bit of a happy coming home to Hornsby. As I walked back from the station, I walked past the cinemas there and came here to the Memorial Hall, and there's lots of memories that I have. I remember coming here, my father dragged me up at dawn for those dawn services once a year, and the sort of fruit chutney curry that you get served, which is not too tasty as an 8-year-old. I also remember the one good thing about delivering The Advocate as a young kid and putting it in everyone's letterboxes. It wasn't the $4 a week you got paid for the delivery. It was once a year you got to have free tickets and popcorn to go to the Hornsby cinemas. And I went to school down there at Hornsby Public, but I've got to say, the change in the face of Hornsby, the change, I grew up sort of on the wrong side of Wahroonga over there near Normanhurst, but that fundamental change, Russell Avenue, the fundamental change that you see in the city, in this part of the city, from what was when I grew up, still had the memories and the feel of a somewhat rural shire. Hornsby Shire Council used to pride itself on being a shire. About having open space, about being green, about having that connection with the land, has in large part been utterly severed. I think when you look at that development along the Pacific Highway, you look at what's happened to Waitara, you look at what is being planned, I think, in the next 5 to 6 years by the O'Farrell government. Now's the time, I think, to stand up and ask, well, what are we getting from our planning system? What do we want from a planning system? And as you walk around Hornsby, as you walk around your suburbs, whether it's up at Mount Colah, down at Westlea, ask yourself if the planning system is delivering what you want in a livable city, or is it delivering for people, apart from residents, is it delivering for a small group of property developers in order to maximise profits and not produce a livable city? Now that's the kind of questions that I ask myself, and the Greens have asked themselves when they looked at Barry O'Farrell's green paper on planning. Now you might have remembered, if people can remember anything about election campaigns, but in the state election campaign leading up to March 2011, and really was the rhetoric of the coalition for about 12 months before then, they said, we've got to get rid of Labor's rotten and corrupted planning laws. We've got to get rid of Part 3A. We've got to return planning powers to the community. And it was a constant rhetoric. And when I looked at some of the coalition flyers, they looked pretty much like they had cut and pasted Greens flyers and a Greens campaign for 2 decades about planning. I've got to say, there was a huge amount of suspicion about whether or not the coalition was serious about returning planning powers to the community, whether or not it was serious about breaking down Labor's sort of corrupting influence of property developers, donators, giving the property industry too big a say in planning. And one of the first things the O'Farrell government did when it got in was it brought in legislation to get rid of what was the notorious Part 3A of the planning laws. And Part 3A was the provision which allowed any development anywhere in the state to be approved, regardless of the local and state planning laws, provided the planning minister gave it an assent. So it was, Part 3A was the epitome of lawless development. Didn't matter what the zoning was, didn't matter what the surrounding development was, didn't matter what the heritage laws said. Part 3A allowed any developer to go and beg the minister or otherwise convince the planning minister to call their development in, and then they could approve anything anywhere. And it brought the planning system into utter disrepute. Because you could see from a number of high-profile cases, a pattern of donation and consent. Donation and consent. Donation and consent. And the connection between the property industry and government was so tight in the days of Labor that there was that push to pull apart Part 3A. So when the Coalition announced they were bringing some legislation into the Parliament to repeal Part 3A, I thought, terrific. There was the joke around that they're probably just going to put in Part 3B. But they were far smarter than that. They didn't put in Part 3B. They put in Part 4. They literally put in Part 4, which cut and pasted most of the key provisions from Part 3A and just made them in a new Part 4. The overriding of heritage laws still applies. The overriding of some of the key consultation processes, local council consents, still applies. The ability for matters to be determined state significant and sort of lift themselves out of the ordinary still applies. But instead of being decided by the Planning Minister, these decisions are now being made by an animal called the Planning Assessment Commission. And that kind of sounds like a grand title, the Planning Assessment Commission. But the Planning Assessment Commission was a creature of the Labor administration. And that Planning Assessment Commission sounds like you would expect that they would have an office and a building and some staff and some genuine independence. But it's just 7 bureaucrats appointed by the Planning Minister who have no resources, no staff, no secretariat to speak of, and are entirely dependent upon the state government planning department and the bureaucrats in the planning department for all of their expertise, for all of their advice, for all of their reports. There is no independent state planning commission. There's 7 bureaucrats appointed by the minister. And those 7 bureaucrats have now been handed the decisions of all these state significant developments. All the old Part 3A projects that were still in the pipeline from the previous Labor government, rather than turning them all off, they all just got transferred into the new system and are now being decided by the Planning Assessment Commission.